Whoa, short hair again. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the fifth album from Biosphere, called Shenzhou. Shenzhou? Whatever. So now we've gotten to the part of the Biosphere story where the videos start to get shorter, mainly after this, but the albums get more interesting. Like, so far we got two big game changers and their two respective inferior follow-ups, but afterwards each of the Biosphere albums has a lot more of a distinct identity apart from each other. They all try unique things that you can't get out of any other Biosphere album, and quite often out of any other album, period. While not every experiment Jansen departed on was altogether successful, I will always have to give him props for pushing himself into new territory. And thankfully, this album shows one of his most successful experiments in my eyes. The vast majority of this album is based around repetitive loops of snippets from the orchestral works of Claude Debussy, putting a spin on them that fits into the typical ambient subspaces that you'd expect out of Biosphere. This isn't totally unproven ground for him. There are moments from his last album, Cirque, that do similar things with the orchestral samples, like on Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, or Iberia Eteria. Not to mention, the particular blend on display here, you could pretty easily make a comparison to the work of Gas, although that doesn't quite nail down what this album is either. See, thing is, Shenzhou is hyper-minimalistic. There is almost nothing to any of these tracks outside of the core sample loop that drives each one. This thing makes Substrata look like FSOL's Lifeforms. Ordinarily, when I go into videos like these, I like to do breakdowns of the instrumentation and discuss all the individual elements that go into each track, but I've pretty much already told you the entire instrumental content of the whole album already. It's looped orchestral samples. Some filtering, maybe some really subtle ambient pads or a low-key synth rhythm or two around the samples, very rarely. But that's it. There's only two outliers to that description with the last two tracks. Bose-Einstein Condensation is a kind of a plinky and strange impressionistic piece that's on some kind of keyboard that is probably a piano, but I can't actually tell. And Gravity Assist is just all synths and pads and field recordings with no samples as far as I can tell. Although even that one fits pretty neatly into the same sonic mold as most of the other tracks behind it, and is trying to sound like the others, even if made out of slightly different ingredients. But that's it. I mentioned that these videos are likely going to be shorter from here on out, because a lot of these mid-later period Biosphere albums have a particularly focused vision, and not as much to say from an individual track basis. This one is a good example, but I want to make it clear, the simplicity of the music does not make Shenzhou boring. Like I said before, Shenzhou is one of his most successful experiments in my eyes, hell, it's one of my favorite albums from him, period. I may not have a ton to say about it, but it's rock solid in my books. The whole thing doesn't give me the same kind of cold Arctic vibes that the last two albums have. It feels like going out in the wilderness, like staying in a cabin in the forest that's by a lake. Not like Gas, which is like going out randomly in the forest where no one else is. But, you know, there's like a little cabin here. There's a little feeling of home, I suppose. Because, like, there's a definite human touch to this album that wasn't really on Cirque. It's much warmer than his last two albums. But it's also got an immensely haunting feeling, like a ghostly presence that carries through every moment and can feel chilling in a very different way. Tracks like the title track, as well as Fast Adam's Escape, Houses on the Hill, and Ancient Campfire, create the sense of swirling menace with its orchestral samples. The latter, Ancient Campfire, is probably the most rhythmic track in the bunch. An interesting moment, that one. But all the melancholic loops of oboes and clarinets or whatever instruments those are do still tie it directly into that same spooky vibe. There are other tracks that feel a bit lonelier or more peaceful, like Spindrift and Heat Leak. as well as the closer, Gravity Assist, super simplistic tracks, but they feel a bit more comforting than those surrounding them. But there are tracks that feel a tad brighter as well. See the warm and comfy pastoral landscape created by green reflections, or the comparatively chipper and optimistic path leading to the high grass. But moments like these strongly contrast with the discomforting loneliness and emptiness created by tracks like Two Ocean Plateau and Thermal Motion. From a mood perspective, this album actually does have really good variety and really solid pacing. Well, not to say I think this album is perfectly paced. Thermal Motion isn't all that interesting to me, even if I do think it's placed in a way to not weigh down the album. And I think Houses on the Hill does drag on a bit longer than it needed to. But for the most part, I find myself getting immersed in this album really easily. It's very simple in its construction, but contains a lot of emotional nuance. Alright, and of course I gotta talk about the bonus tracks. Thankfully this is the last album I actually need to do that for, but this one had an entire bonus album added to the 2017 reissue called The Campfire Tower. Now, this bonus album actually does not feel like a collection of B-sides and unreleased tracks in the same way the bonus stuff on Microgravity, Potashnik, and Circle were. The Campfire Tower, as you may pick up from the fact that it has an actual title, it feels like its own decently fleshed out and cohesive project. 9 tracks that fit together and make sense being digested together. They do not, however, make a lot of sense next to Shenzhou. This isn't like Substrata 2's Man with a Movie Camera soundtrack, which felt like an expansion on the original album. The Campfire Tower just feels like a completely different project that has, like, nothing to do with Shenzhou at all. It's mostly based around Jansen's field recordings from various different places, assumingly described in the titles, with some subtle synth pads accompanying each one, and driving the kind of mood I suppose he associates with all these places. These don't feel nearly as detached from society, though. A lot of these field recordings are of trains and ferry ports, and they feel closer to some bigger city. But I do enjoy me some field recordings every now and then, and these are some nice and detailed ones that do create quite a deep-sounding environment, and the synth pads are quite evocative and moody. There's even some neat little surprises, like the track Shuttle Hiss Tunnel, which is surprisingly intense and dramatic. It kind of caught me off guard, even. This thing actually really picks up once I got to Lorry's Shuttle Shaft and kept my interest from there. Before that, it was cool, but it was not really anything super to write home about. But these tracks also don't really have the same sense of humanity that the main album does. It all feels very metallic and detached from human contact, creating a pretty stark contrast with its mood that, while about equally as energetic as the main album, seems to give off an overall effect that is almost the complete opposite in many ways. Shenzhou felt like it told more of a romanticized story. Campfire Tower set up a real-world atmosphere that was also quite dark but doesn't really feature any humans. If Shenzhou is the soundtrack to a super moody animated movie, Campfire Tower soundtrack's a collage of well-shot and mood-evoking stock footage. The single track on here that resembles the main album is the closer, The White Cliffs of Dover, which has repetitive samples of a distant horn section and a bassy pad. It's a nice little mini triumphant closer or something like that. Though even this would feel a tad out of place on the main album, given the sample doesn't feel like it's taken from similar sources. But I suppose if anything, this bonus album does have a similar nocturnal vibe to it. It's the kind of album where you can really picture the glum, overcast skies above you. I don't think the Campfire Tower is a masterpiece or anything, not nearly as emotionally satisfying as the main album, but at the very least, this does have value as its own little mini bonus album that can stand perfectly fine on its own merits, if a bit short. Like, it's pretty good. I might even look into keeping it around, albeit keeping it entirely separate from the main album. Like, maybe if I were to judge that the Campfire Tower purely by itself, it might be like a 7.3 out of 10 or something like that. It's actually pretty solid. Just wish it were packaged by itself. So now with that out of the way, let's finally get into my final thoughts on the main album. Now, I do think Cirque was probably a more creative project than Shenzhou. had more new ideas that it brought to the table, including some that were further explored here. I also like the variety on there a lot more. In this album, it can get formulaic to a point where I can see it getting annoying for some people. But those looped Debussy samples give it a sound that you can't get anywhere else, and one that feels very much like something you'd only hear from Biosphere. Very subtle, but very effective. This album is definitely a mood album. It's the kind of thing that works best at night, even when I listen to it during the day. It evokes imagery of the nighttime. I can definitely understand if it's not for everyone, but to me, this album is kind of the sleeper hit in his catalog. The one that not enough people really highlight while they're too busy discussing the merits of Substrata. This is not an album that I have a lot of words for, really. It's not an album that has like a lot of moving parts or anything, but it is one that I wholeheartedly enjoy listening to, and one that I will definitely recommend to people. Sometimes less is more. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.